My mother had a saying she repeated every single Sunday at the dinner table: feelings are for people who can't afford consequences. I didn't understand it when I was 7. By the time I was 26, I had it memorized like a prayer I never wanted to say. She would sit at the head of that mahogany table in her St. Louis blazer. Always the blazer, always the pearls, always the posture of someone being watched. And she would look at me like I was a case she hadn't finished arguing yet. My mother was a corporate attorney. She had made partner at 34. She'd raised my brother and me the same way she handled depositions, with precision, with pressure, and with the absolute certainty that she was the smartest person in the room. My father was quieter about it. He taught economics at Washington University. He didn't yell. He just had this way of going silent that was somehow louder than anything my mother ever said. When I told them I wanted to study photography instead of pre-law, he set down his fork, folded his napkin, and left the table. That was it. No scene. Just absence. Which, in our house, was the clearest message he knew how to send. I was 22 when I graduated with a degree in communications. The compromise we'd landed on after 2 years of cold dinners and colder phone calls. Photography was a hobby, they said. Communications was at least adjacent to something real. I told myself it was fine. I had a minor in studio art. I had my camera. I had weekends. What I didn't have was any idea that everything was about to collapse. It started with the layoffs. I was working at a marketing agency downtown, doing content and social media strategy, and I was decent at it. Not passionate, but decent. Then the agency lost 2 of its biggest accounts in the same quarter and let go of everyone under 5 years tenure. Just like that, I was back in my childhood bedroom at 24, trying not to feel like a failure while my mother left law review journals on my nightstand with sticky notes that said things like, "It's not too late to take the LSAT." That was when I started shooting again. Not for clients, not for anyone, just for myself. Early mornings before the house woke up, I'd drive out to the edges of the city and photograph whatever I found. Abandoned lots. Laundromats at 6 a.m. Old women's walking small dogs in the fog. I wasn't trying to make anything of it. I was just trying to breathe. Then a woman named, well, I'll call her my mentor, because that's what she became, found my work. She ran a small contemporary gallery in the Midtown Arts District. She'd seen a series I'd posted online, black and white portraits of shift workers at the end of long nights, and she asked if I wanted to show. Not sell, just show. A group exhibition, 6 photographers, 1 wall. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I didn't tell my parents. I told myself it was because I didn't want to hear their reaction, which was true. But if I'm honest, I also didn't tell them because I didn't want them in that room with me. That gallery. Those photographs. It was the first thing that had ever been entirely mine. The opening was a Thursday evening in October. I wore a dress I'd bought at a consignment shop in the Delmar Loop and my grandmother's earrings. Small gold hoops she'd left me when she passed. The only inheritance I'd received that felt like it actually had something to do with me. I stood next to my photographs for 3 hours and talked to strangers about light and shadow and why the overnight shift at a bread factory looks like a Rembrandt painting if you catch it at the right angle. 2 pieces sold that night. Not for much. $600 total. But someone had looked at something I made and decided it was worth hanging in their home. And I walked back to my car at 11 o'clock feeling more like myself than I had in years. My mother was awake when I got home. She was in the kitchen with a glass of wine and a brief she was reviewing, and she looked up and asked where I'd been. I told her. The silence that followed was the particular kind she used when she was deciding how to proceed strategically. "A gallery show?" she said finally. "Yes." "For photography?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, the way she nodded in court when a witness had just said something she intended to use against them. "And this is what you want to be doing with your time." It wasn't a question, it was an assessment. I told her yes. I told her that it had gone well, that 2 pieces had sold, that my mentor thought I had real potential for a solo show in the spring if I kept working. I was trying to give her data because data was the language she understood. She set down the brief. She took off her reading glasses. She looked at me with an expression I'd seen her use exactly once before, when my brother had told her he was dropping his pre-med courses sophomore year, an expression that wasn't anger yet, but was the room where anger lived. I have spent 30 years building something in this city, she said. Your father has spent 30 years building something in this city. We have a reputation. We have a name that means something. And you want to spend your time taking pictures of, what did you say? Factory workers. Bread factory workers, I said, which I immediately knew was a mistake. I'm not going to support this. I'm not asking you to support it. I sold 2 pieces tonight. $600. She said it the way she would have said Exhibit A. You sold 2 pieces for $600. Do you understand what that actually means in terms of a sustainable? Mom. Don't mom me. I'm talking to you about your future. I know you are, and I'm telling you this is what I want my future to look like. My father appeared in the doorway then. He'd heard us, or he'd been listening, I was never sure which. He stood there in his robe and his reading glasses, and he looked at me with that economist's assessment, that quality-adjusted life years calculation he seemed to run on everything. You're wasting your potential, he said. That was all. And then he went back upstairs. My mother turned back to her brief. I think you should sleep on this, she said. We'll talk in the morning. We didn't talk in the morning. We didn't talk much at all for the next 3 weeks, which wasn't unusual for us. We were a family that processed conflict by going around it until it calcified into normal. I kept photographing. I kept meeting with my mentor. I kept applying for marketing jobs half-heartedly because it seemed like the responsible thing to do, which it was, and I resented it, which I also was. Then I got the call. A collector. A serious one. Someone whose name I recognized from the arts section of the Post-Dispatch had seen my work at the group show and wanted to talk about purchasing a full series. Not one piece. A series. He had a specific project in mind. He was curating a collection around American labor, blue-collar work, the physical dignity of ordinary employment. He'd seen my overnight portraits and thought they belonged in it. We met at a coffee shop on Euclid Avenue. He was older, maybe 65, with the kind of unhurried manner that comes from never having needed to rush. He asked me questions about my process, my influences, my vision. He ordered a cortado and a pastry and seemed genuinely interested in my answers, which was more than I could say for most of the people I'd talked to in the past 2 years. By the end of the meeting, he had offered me a commission, 24 photographs, a 12-month timeline, full creative control. The fee was $40,000, plus 30% of any future sale of the series. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I signed the contract 2 days later. I didn't tell my parents. Over the next year, I built something. I worked, I traveled on weekends to document workers in industries I'd never photographed before. Agricultural processing in rural Missouri, warehouse distribution on the overnight shift, a textile mill in Tennessee that had been operating for 60 years. I was meticulous. I was obsessed. I shot thousands of frames to find the 24 that belonged in the series, and when I found them, I knew it immediately, the way you know when a sentence is finally right. The collector was pleased, more than pleased. He began showing the series privately to other collectors he knew, and the response was something none of us had anticipated. By the time the series was formally appraised and placed in his collection, its total valuation had reached $1.2 million. I want to stop here and say something because I know how that number sounds. It sounds unreal. It sounded unreal to me. Art valuation is a strange ecosystem. It's part aesthetic, part market, part provenance, part timing, and I am not going to pretend I fully understand why my work was valued the way it was. What I know is that the collector believed in it before I did, and that belief, combined with his network and his reputation, created something I could never have manufactured on my own. I was lucky. I was also good. Both things were true, and I've spent a long time learning to hold both at once instead of dismissing one to protect the other. But here is what changed my life specifically. The collector had a contact at a major auction house who suggested that the series, given its provenance and the attention it had received in collector circles, might perform well at auction. There was a moment in the contemporary photography market Late in the year, certain conditions aligning that seemed worth attempting. We had conversations, we had valuations, we had months of back and forth that I barely understood despite the lawyers I'd hired to help me understand it. The series sold at auction for $2.8 million. After fees and taxes, and yes, I paid my taxes. Every cent. I had a CPA and an attorney, and I was not going to make that mistake. I walked away with just over $1.9 million. I was 26 years old, and I had been sleeping in my childhood bedroom 3 years before. I didn't tell my parents immediately. I needed to process it first. I needed to sit in my apartment. I had moved out 8 months earlier, into a small place in the Shaw neighborhood, and understand what had happened to my life before I tried to explain it to anyone else. I called my mentor first. She cried. I cried. We split a bottle of wine over video chat, and she told me she had known from the first photograph she'd ever seen of mine that I was going to be fine, and even though I didn't believe her entirely, I needed to hear it. I told my parents 3 weeks later. I had lunch with them. Sunday, the mahogany table, the pearls, and I waited until the food was on the table, and then I told them what had happened. The silence was different this time. My mother set down her fork very slowly. My father looked at me over his reading glasses. Neither of them spoke for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. My mother said, "How much?" I told her. My father said, "After taxes?" "After everything," I said. "I have a CPA, it's done properly." Another silence. "And you've been managing this yourself?" my mother said. She was using her deposition voice, but it had a crack in it I hadn't heard before. "With a financial advisor and an attorney," I said. "Yes." She picked up her fork. She set it down again. And then she said something I genuinely did not expect. "I didn't know you were capable of this." She meant it as a compliment. I understood that, but I sat with it for a long time afterward because it told me everything I needed to know about what she had thought of me before. The months that followed were strange. My parents were proud of me, openly, in the way they spoke about me to their colleagues and friends, but proud in the particular way of people who are recalibrating, who are adjusting their model of a person without quite acknowledging that the old model had been wrong. My mother started calling more often. My father started asking about my investment strategy. They invited me to dinners I hadn't been invited to before, at restaurants I hadn't been taken to since I was a child being displayed at some function as evidence of their success. I went sometimes. I wanted to believe it was different. Then my brother called. He and I had never been close. Not really. He was 4 years older. He'd followed the path our parents had mapped. He was a corporate attorney now himself, married, living in the suburbs. Very much the son they had planned for. We didn't fight. We just existed in parallel, two versions of a family's possibility space, and I was the one they'd stopped believing in. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon and started with small talk, which he never did, and I knew within 30 seconds that something was coming. He and his wife were in trouble. Financially. He didn't say specifically what kind. I got the broad outline only, but it involved bad investments, a mortgage refinancing that had gone badly, and something about a business venture with a partner who had turned out to be considerably less reliable than advertised. "I'm not asking for a handout," he said, which people always say right before they ask for a handout. He needed $80,000. He would pay it back. He had a plan. He walked me through the plan in the careful, measured way of someone who had clearly rehearsed it, and the plan was, I'll be honest, not terrible. He was still smart, my brother, regardless of what else was true about him. But all I could think about, sitting there on my couch with my phone pressed to my ear, was that this was the same man who had once told me at our parents' table that my photography was a really sweet hobby in the tone of someone patting a child on the head. "I need to think about it," I said. "Of course," he said. "Take your time." He called again 4 days later. Then my mother called. Separately. She was very careful not to ask directly. My mother never asked for anything directly. It wasn't her style. But the call had a structure I recognized from every negotiation she'd ever run in my periphery. She talked about family. She talked about how hard things could be, how even careful people hit unforeseen circumstances. She said my brother had always been supportive of me. I let that one sit for a second. Mom, I said. He told me my photography was a sweet hobby. He was trying to be encouraging. He was being dismissive, we both know that. A pause. People say things. They do, I said, and then sometimes the situation changes and suddenly everyone remembers that they were always supportive. She didn't say anything. I love you, I told her. And I meant it, imperfectly, through a lot of complicated history. But I meant it. I love both of you. And I am not in a position to give my brother $80,000 right now. You have nearly $2 million, Joelle. It was the first time she'd used my name in the conversation, my actual name, not the generic you she usually deployed when she wanted distance. I have investments, I said. I have a financial plan that my advisor and I built carefully. I have taxes and reserves and the beginning of a career that may or may not continue to generate income at this level. I have a lot of things that look like money, but are not a checking account I can just write a check from. None of that was untrue. It also wasn't the whole truth, and she knew it. Your father is very worried, she said. About his son's financial situation, I said, which his son created. Joelle. I'll call you Sunday, I said. I love you. I hung up. I sat in my apartment for a long time after that call. I'd moved again by then, not to anything extravagant. Not yet, just a nicer apartment in the central West End. High ceilings, big windows, the kind of place where I could actually hang my own work on the walls. I looked at the photographs around me. The ones that hadn't sold, the ones I'd kept, the ones that had been part of the series before I'd culled it down. And I thought about what it had taken to make them. The 5 a.m. drives. The cold. The workers who had looked at me through the viewfinder with this particular dignity that I'd spent months trying to understand how to capture. The years of being told I was wasting something. I thought about my grandmother's gold hoops. The ones I'd worn to the opening. The ones that were the only inheritance that had ever felt like it belonged to me. My grandmother, my mother's mother, had been a seamstress. She'd worked in a garment factory for 30 years and then run alterations out of her home for 20 more. She'd made decent money at it, and she'd been proud of her work in a way that my mother, who had spent her entire career trying to be taken seriously in rooms that had mostly held men, seemed to find embarrassing, like it was something to move past rather than something to honor. I had photographed women like her, women with capable hands and quiet pride, and someone had found that worth $2.8 million at auction. There was something in that I couldn't quite name, but I felt it in the way you feel a temperature change, suddenly, all at once. I didn't give my brother the money. I made that decision, and I sat with it, and I waited to feel guilty, and what I felt instead was clarity, not cruelty. I wasn't trying to punish anyone, but clarity. A clean sense of what I was and wasn't responsible for. My brother was a grown man with an income and a wife, with an income and parents who were, between the two of them, earning close to $400,000 a year. He had options. He had people in his life who had always been the right kind of people to him. I was not his contingency plan. I called him back on a Saturday. He answered on the second ring. I've thought about it, I said. I'm not going to be able to help with this one. A beat. Joelle. I know this isn't what you were hoping to hear. Do you know how serious this is? We could lose the house. I understand that's a real possibility, I said. I hope you're able to find a solution that works for your family. You have the money. I have my money, I said, which I earned and which I have plans for. The silence on his end had a texture to it. Disbelief maybe, or recalibration. The same thing I'd heard in my mother's voice at the Sunday table, but sharper. I never thought you'd be like this, he said finally. Like what? He didn't answer. I didn't think you'd be the kind of person who would tell your sister that her life's work was a sweet hobby, I said. Not with anger. I was past the anger by then. But with the same even tone my mother used when she wanted someone to understand exactly what they'd admitted. And yet, people surprise you. I heard him exhale. I hope things get better for you, I said. I genuinely do. Goodbye. The thing about that phone call is that I expected it to hurt more than it did. I had braced for the guilt, for the sick stomach feeling of having turned down family, for the voices in my head that sounded like Sunday dinners and pearls. What I felt instead, standing in my apartment with the winter light coming through the big windows, was something I didn't have an immediate word for. Later that night, I looked it up, actually. Tried to find the right word, and the closest I got was the Portuguese word saudade. Except in reverse. Not a longing for something lost, but a relief at something finally laid down. A weight you'd carried so long you'd stopped noticing it, and then one day you set it on the ground and your whole posture changed. I used part of the money to lease studio space in the Cortex district, a real studio, not a bedroom with good light. I hired an assistant, a young photographer fresh out of UMSL who was hungry and talented and reminded me of myself 3 years earlier. We built a workflow. We took on clients. I also kept shooting personal work. Because that was the thing I would not compromise on, the line I had drawn from the beginning. 18 months after the auction, my mentor helped me put together a solo exhibition. It ran for 6 weeks. It sold out. Not at auction prices. Those were unusual circumstances, a particular alignment I didn't expect to repeat, but real prices, meaningful prices. Enough to know that what I'd built was not a one-time event, but a practice, a body of work with its own life in the world. My parents came to the opening. My mother wore the pearls. My father wore his university blazer. They stood in front of my photographs for a long time without saying anything, and then my mother turned to me and said, "You have a real eye." I thanked her. I didn't say, "I've always had a real eye. You just weren't looking." I didn't say feelings aren't only for people who can't afford consequences. Sometimes consequences are exactly what feelings are for. I didn't say anything actually. I just smiled and went to talk to the next person who wanted to tell me what they saw in the work, and I let the moment be what it was, imperfect, late, genuine enough. My grandmother's earrings were in my ears that night. They always are at openings. I think she would have understood exactly why. I keep thinking about the moment my mother said, "I didn't know you were capable of this." Not because it hurt, though it did, a little, in the way an old scar aches when the weather changes, but because of what it revealed about the years before it. All those Sunday dinners, all those folded napkins and quiet exits, the entire architecture of my childhood had been built on an assessment of me that turned out to be wrong, and nobody had ever thought to question the blueprint. What I've come to understand, slowly and not without some resistance, is that what happened to me wasn't really about talent or luck or even money. It was about cause and effect in the most ordinary sense. My mother raised me to believe that discipline without feeling was strength. My father taught me that value was something external, something conferred by institutions and titles and the right kind of recognition. And for a long time I believed them, because children believe the people who feed them. But belief that doesn't survive contact with reality isn't wisdom. It's just inheritance. The real turning point wasn't the auction. It wasn't the first sale or the gallery show, or even the morning I signed my studio lease and stood in the empty space with the light coming through the windows and felt, for the first time, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The real turning point was quieter than any of that. It was the decision, made over and over in small moments across several years, to keep going when the easier thing would have been to stop. To drive out at 5 a.m. and photograph something nobody had asked me to photograph. To say yes to a group show when I had no guarantee it would lead anywhere. To sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood by the people whose understanding I'd wanted most. That's the part nobody tells you about building something real. It requires a kind of integrity that isn't glamorous. Not the integrity of grand gestures or public stands, but the daily unglamorous kind. The kind that means you do the work even when you're not sure it matters, that you tell the truth even when a comfortable silence would cost you nothing, that you make decisions based on what you actually believe rather than what you're afraid people will think. And then there's the intelligence part. Not book intelligence, not test scores, but the willingness to look clearly at what's in front of you and understand it accurately, even when accuracy is inconvenient. I had to understand what my brother was actually asking me, beneath the rehearsed presentation and the careful language. I had to understand what my mother's pride actually meant and what it didn't mean. Clear thinking, in the end, is its own form of self-respect. What carried me through all of it, though, the layoffs, the cold dinners, the years of being the family's wrong answer, was something I can only describe as refusal. Not anger, not bitterness, just a quiet and persistent refusal to accept someone else's ceiling as my own. That stubbornness was the thing underneath everything else. It was what got me out of bed at 4:45 in the morning. It was what kept me in that gallery talking to strangers about light when every instinct said I didn't belong there. I wore my grandmother's earrings to every opening I ever had. She worked with her hands for 50 years and she was proud of it. She didn't need anyone to tell her that her work had value. She already knew. I think that's the thing I was really trying to photograph all along. Not factories, not shift workers, not bread or thread or loading docks in the fog. Just that. Just the face of someone who already knows.